Hello, I'm Will Yeoman. I'm CEO of Writing WA, and I'm here today with Bruce Powell. Now, Bruce, you would describe yourself as an emerging writer. Would that be right? A neophyte?
Well, somebody told me that just because you write doesn't make you a writer. Now, I know then generous people say, "Oh, come on," but look, my initial dip into the world of writing. And I'm sure writers will hear me say, will kind of mouth obscenities when I say, but it turns out it's very difficult. It actually turns out that writing is really complicated and really difficult. And then when you think you've got it, you hand it to someone else and they tell you what they think of it and give you back. So there used to be a day when my opinion mattered, and it turns out mostly now that it's not. And yet I do write, and I have begun to explore the joys of writing, and also for me the therapeutic values of writing, and also as an older sort of white male bloke actually discover that there's a whole bunch of things again that I wasn't aware of.
You actually don't know.
No, and both in terms of, and not only just in terms of actually my own life now, but also the medical side of life, because of course prior to 5 years ago I was an intensive care specialist, and suddenly on the other side of the bed it turns out that life is very different.
Yes.
And so writing, events that befell me have all actually had me kind of reborn in a new life. I used to joke that I was the Benjamin Button of dementia in that I started from a place of no idea what was going on, and have come back gradually through a recognition that firstly I'm nuts, and now I'm nuts a bit, and now actually I now have a grip and now have much more of an idea of what has passed. And in a funny way, I think, like Benjamin Button discovered, it's quite traumatic to recognise what's going to happen and what's gone. And so, but it's a joy. Genuinely, it's a joy. And it's not to say that necessarily one would take that path if one had the choice. But given that here I am, exploring the writing world, meeting people, writers' festivals, appearing at, attending book shows, has been such a joy, because it is genuinely a rebirth for me. Genuinely a rebirth, and it's a joy. It is new, and obviously all of us are slightly, we're never particularly comfortable with change. I think uncertainty and change are things that we probably try to deceive ourselves that don't exist, but clearly they do. I mean, to coin a phrase, shit definitely does happen, and I think one has to get up and go, okay, well, that's interesting, let's try again.
Absolutely.
And here we are.
So let's take a step back then.
Yes.
And tell us a bit more about your background and how you indeed did end up here.
So I was a sort of, again, on reflection, quite a sort of neurodiverse kid.
Right.
Never paid any attention, never really took any note of what was going on at school, and coincidentally was very bright. And I don't say that as any kind of boast. It's simply the fact that it was. And in some ways, as we know now, that actually whatever talents you bring, with that also comes some downside. So, I was, very difficult to concentrate, and ended up, in schools, when you've got someone who's bright, I think your schools in those days go, ooh, either a lawyer or a doctor. And I happened to be doing sciences, so got
took the latter.
Well, you get channeled towards being a doctor, and had no idea about medicine. I mean, I always felt a bit uncomfortable when people in a sort of Miss World would sort of say, oh, well, I want to help people, and I want to help the sick. I never felt like that.
I'm sorry, I should have asked, this is in the UK, is that right?
Yeah, this is UK, yeah, sorry, yeah. So I knew what doctors did, but I didn't have any experience of illness. I'd never been ill, none of my family, but it seemed like a good idea, and clearly there was merit in it, and as a young sort of fairly narcissistic kid, when people said, oh, you're going to be a doctor, well, that's a great thing, isn't it? Absolutely. And so I tried to get in, and I failed, because I just didn't do any work. I didn't do any work. And eventually ended up in France. Having failed my exams, I ended up in France looking after an old chap who was terribly ill with Parkinson's, with a neurological disease. Okay. And sort of started to see him suffer, and in a very strange way, he suddenly went, okay, I get this. Okay, so I get that it's not about me, it's about... Yeah. And I found it quite comfortable to be with him, to help him. It didn't, again, peculiarly neurodiverse in that I'm not especially empathetic, but I did understand what others needed, and actually I could give that without finding it distressing, and actually ironically became rather inspired by that, and so sort of took a break from France and went back to the Royal Free in London and knocked on the Dean's door and said, "You need to give me a place." And he said, "Well, who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm..." And he said, "Well, you can't just knock on people's doors." And I said, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" So again, that bizarre sort of slightly unconventional way which had me not get in was actually now the only thing to get me in. And so I had a long medical career through... Well, I joined the Navy first, obviously as a sort of whim because my friend decided to. So again, without any planning, I joined the Navy. Spent 6 years with them, and then kind of came back and asked a former girlfriend to marry me the day after I met her, which again is, the typical sort of fairly, well, let's just do it and see how it goes. And we've been married for 30 years, and then spent a time as an intensivist and anaesthetist, all sort of different specialties. Yes. And ended up in Australia. And again, through complete luck, started cycling just because it was an easy way to get to work. Became rather obsessive about that because that has been the way for me with all sorts of things, either connected or not. And as part of that, ended up racing and had a sort of unfortunate, catastrophic accident, and woke up with a sort of, my career had ended, I was brain damaged, broke my neck, and so now there was a whole new life, and that's 5 years ago now, and it's been an absolute joy, as we were talking. Not a joy that it happened, not a joy that was the path I took, but where I am now, given that that's how we are. Speaking to you, I've been so lucky to go to the Writers' Festivals, Margaret River Writers' Festival, Writers' Festivals in Perth, and sit and listen to people. And dare I say, us senior doctors, we're still held in, I think, high esteem by the community, and I think you end up on quite a tall pedestal. And my experience is it's a long way to fall, and so it's taken me a bit of time to perhaps become a better listener than I was. But it's also fascinating, and we were joking about meeting people with ideas and beliefs different to mine, and actually my first reaction is, "Oh, don't be ridiculous." But of course that's the old me, the sort of doctor. You have to be quite confident in your opinion. For me as an intensive care specialist, you're often confronted where there isn't an answer. You have to make a decision.
And just to do the job.
But you have to then forget that when you try to become a writer and you listen to other people, and so often, the joy has been that I've met so many more people, different people, in the writing community than I did as a medic. As a medic, I think one is sort of always looked to for advice. Whereas actually, as a participant in the writing community, you have to listen to people and go away and think about what they've just said, and then consider it and come back and think about it. Whereas, my job was always about making decisions. About particularly as a senior, you were only ever asked questions when there wasn't an answer, because in fact your job as a senior was to just make a decision. If there'd been an obvious answer, they wouldn't answer you. Whereas, of course, they wouldn't ask you. Whereas, of course, as a writer, who knows what the right answer is?
You're confronted on a daily basis with uncertainty.
Absolutely.
And there isn't any right answer.
No, and so you exactly. So you ask, I've worked with 3 or 4 editors, all of whom have a different style. All of whom have a different focus. One was very much sort of professorial, great English, and another one is very sort of lyrical, and also one is terribly hard on me. Another one says, "Oh no, Bruce, I think that's great," and all of them have contributed to me sort of trying to piece together, well, what does my voice sound like, and what does my tone? And in fact, I think I've spoken a lot about particularly Adam Kay, who obviously, is a kind of obviously, a doctor himself, and, reflected on how I always find that the tone of his writing early on, I think, reflects the trauma that he's been through, in his career. And I noticed that with my own work is I think as a junior doctor, it's very easy to shock people. It's very easy to write in a way that's quite guttural and disturbing, almost as a way of sort of saying, do you understand what I've been through? But of course, one then recognises, well, that's not the point. It's not the point to shock people. Actually, the point is given that it's difficult, what do I take from that? And actually, of course, I don't want to write for doctors. I don't want to write for the medical profession. I'd like to write and speak to people about challenges and uncertainty and identity and about loss, and kind of say, well, given that I never really thought about that, this is my experience of it, and then invite other people to say, like, I always joke to say I don't remember the first year of my trauma, and joke with people who I've met, who've had terrible injuries and remember it all, and say, well, that's easy because, and they say, well, of course, I'd much rather not remember. Well, my journey has been much more trying to remember, trying to recall, because my experience has been that void is very traumatic. And I always think, and again, like with people writing life stories, I think it's a fascinating, increasingly, I think, people interested area for people, because especially I think the older generation, so much of their experience is somehow lost and somehow so different to now that one gets a sense of loss, that is there a diminished value because people don't understand it. And I figure that, for me, for example, writing about my experience, it's for me to translate it into something broadly and appealing and generic. People go
the general readership.
Yeah, exactly. Loss and struggle.
Tapping into those universals.
There you go. Because as I think there's something deeply uninteresting about a doctor spinning yarns. I mean, I think there's value, but only if you contextualise it in what does that mean for more people. As I said, I don't think. I think people read. Well, it sounds terrible. I don't know if it's a great analogy, but I want to be more sort of James Herriot and kind of warm and humorous, but also poignant. You read his writing, and he only wrote 8 books, but that idea, that character, that setting affords all. It's not about veterinary science, is it? You see the odd occasional horrific sort of cow's rear end, but that's not the point of it. And I figure that with medicine is that I happen to have been a doctor, and so happen to write about things through medicine, but not about medicine. It's not about that. And as I said, as I grew, as I matured from a sort of fairly reckless youngster to starting to understand about other people's loss. And of course, as a critical care clinician, you only ever see people critically ill. You don't see them leave. When they leave, we pat ourselves on the back and say, well, that's a win. And of course, my experience of that is that that's the start of it. That is at 5-6 years on, I'm still battling with the much more complex issue. ICU is kind of live or die, broken or not. And it turns out that life is much more nuanced, and much more complex. And again, I can imagine people listening to this going, well, how could you not know that? Well, because one is so... a bit like, I imagine, I remember reading Stephen King's book about how to write, and he says, lockable door, turn the wire off and write. So I imagine when writers disappear into their own world to have to write, to really fight, I can imagine that as a very deeply intense, and that was how it was for me. And
exactly
when
right.
You appear from your unlocked door and go, what happened? And I like that kind of appeals to me, although obviously it's quite a change. It's very much a change, and I also find that my wife will say, well, what have you done today? Now, as a doctor, it was obvious because there was a list of patients. But as a writer, I now kind of look at my pages and go... and of course, was it Hemingway who said that of every 100 words he wrote, 99 was shit? So I'm about I'm still not as good as that. But again, I think... it's hard. And also, being creative, when... it seems to me it's very hard to dial in creativity. It's hard to schedule it. And yet people say, well... you have to sit down and be disciplined in your writing, and that's of course a huge struggle. And so it's all fascinating, and it's all such a joy. And as I said, I know that perhaps I would actually confirm what people think about doctors as fairly narrow-minded and fairly sort of convinced of their own immortality. And as I said, it turns out that if you do something sufficiently reckless, that you're actually not immortal, and actually. It's quite a tough old gig, being a patient and being a carer and, all those things. So, maybe in the future I'll get a chance to sort of maybe express that and thereby inform both sides of the conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, ironically, if you write a masterpiece, that does ensure your immortality. A lot of writers want that. They want to be remembered for this one masterpiece forever.
But when people write, though, don't most of them say to you, oh, of course, it's not very... Don't most writers are the hardest critics of their own?
Oh no, look, of course they are. A lot of them are. I mean, I guess I'm talking about a stereotype, a cliche. I think this is Shakespeare. Even a lot of his sonnets were all about that, saying I or you will live forever in these lines as long as people read them.
Okay.
As long as there's someone to read them, they will be remembered.
Well, I did read. My friend of mine's a filmmaker, and he said that there is a as you said a saying about film that a film only exists if people watch it.
Indeed.
And that's a very interesting. Again, my experience of memory is physically I have a memory of what happened. Whether that's actually what happened is very difficult. And of course, we see that, don't we, so often with writers and witnesses to things, is that. I mean, hence, isn't that why memoir is called non-fiction? I never understood that. Well, is it? Then it must be fact. Oh, well, it's not.
Yeah, well, this is it, yeah. And then there's this strange thing now called autofiction, which I don't know if you've heard of, which is it's a novel, but it's so close to autobiography that they call it, instead of autobiography, they call it autofiction.
So is that a legal thing? Are they just avoiding the fact that somebody goes, hang on a sec, that's me?
I don't know, but I've always read a lot of novelists, and I've said, hang on, this is so obviously based on this person's life.
Yeah,
even if you don't know that for a fact, it just reads like that.
But I mean, people do say you should write what you know. I guess.
Well, there you are. But it's to what extent you do. I mean, obviously, you're writing.
Well, I have dabbled with fiction as well, and the fiction was uncomfortably close to what I do, apart from the fact that the star of the show had a rather unfortunate sort of psychopathic nature, and somebody said to me, whatever you do, don't put your own name to that, because obviously, again, as a specialist in that area, it's very easy to write very convincingly, and in fact, when you watch TV shows, they're desperately unconvincing. I mean, intensive care, for example, is tedious. There's not been a TV show about intensive care because nothing happens. Weeks and weeks go by, and Will sort of twitches a finger or if lifts an eyelid, and people go, "Well, is that the whole show?" There's nothing. So actually, that whole show would be about the carers, would be about the person at the bedside, because the person with the tubes and stuff in has no idea of the passing of time,
exactly right,
and often wake up with no idea of what happened. So actually, it's the impact of their suffering on their relatives, and thereby that the professional care workers, because of course, again, another issue for us is everything that you witness you can't take home with you. So there's a sort of there's an ability to silo what you see in somewhere else now, and then as a writer now, as someone who writes, my challenge is to access those things that I've consciously put away and produce them in a way that makes sense to people other than me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very,
lots of things we would kind of laugh about because they're not funny.
Yes.
But what are you going to do? Because tomorrow there's another day with the same. So I've been very lucky, as I said, that there's a huge area of things to explore. And as a terribly amateurish writer, one's challenge is to produce that in a way that people want to read. And I know, that debate about self-published or published. For me, being published is the aim, because I feel then that there's a certain vindication in that must be good enough. Now I know that, I'm sure writers listening to that would go, yeah, well, good luck with publishers, and I get that. But I quite like trying to understand a new industry, understand a new skill.
Oh, look, it's the right step to take first.
Yeah.
Go to traditional publishers, saying, I'm interested in this book. Yeah. I mean, there are all those sort of competitions as well for unpublished manuscripts that all the publishers run too. They're perfect for this kind of...
Yeah, exactly. And then also, writing newspaper articles, writing medical...
Absolutely.
I mean, my son, we've just had a fabulous experience. My son and I have just published an article for the Medical Journal of Australia, which is one of the top 20 in the world. He and I talking about he's a psychology student now, talking about brain injury and talking about the government's actions to try to improve rehabilitation.
Okay.
Now, for both of us, Josh as somebody who witnessed his father go through it, and me as a former clinician, that in itself, to write it, but for a journal, one then has to try to keep it on the facts, not too sort of dramatic. Whereas if you then write for newspapers. 800 words, and ironically, now that I've learned how to do it, the last time I wrote something for them, it appeared before usually I get a certain sort of what's this supposed to be?
Yeah.
And it appeared, and I realised they hadn't asked me. They just published it.
Yeah.
Which again, but I think for a lot of people, it wouldn't be their taste to write to what you want.
Yes.
But I figure, well, if a publisher's taking on the financial risk of me as a writer, then it's behoved upon me to write to the style they want. And I know people say, yeah, but well, it's not my writing. Then, well, no, but that's, again, I think it's a fascinating conversation. Is do you want to write just for you or for others, or again, like with Life Story, who are you writing it for?
It's still your writing, but you do have to understand your audience if you're really serious about communicating.
Well, there you
need
go.
to understand your audience.
There you go, and I think that's a great way of pricing, as you said, is that. Do you want to, as I say, have a conversation with an audience, or do you want to tell people what you think? And I think, the first iterations of my writing were simply me saying, these are the things I remember and this is how I felt about them. And actually, a lot of those are not, they're too far beyond most people's experience of it to go, I don't even know what you mean. What do you mean you're in the pub with your friends laughing about it? Well, that's because we're all traumatised by it, and no one wants to sit in a pub with young men and cry about a woman they saw die, so we make a joke of it. Is it funny? No. Why laughing? Well, because what else? Again, because tomorrow I go in, and again, I think nowadays there's much more of a recognition of the impact upon healthcare clinicians. But my issue is, well, but you're still not the one who's ill. So here we go. So there's a whole sort of old Krusty's now going, pull your socks up, and actually, I think society is not like that. And again. I would love to be able to communicate beyond my own middle-aged male thing and say, well, look, let's talk about loss and identity.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a much more interesting thing. Like I said, my friend who believes that Uri Geller really did bend spoons. It's actually much more interesting to ask her, how did you come to that conclusion, rather than say, don't be ridiculous.
Agreed.
Middle-aged men do tend to say, don't be ridiculous, because and I think. I always thought that one of the signs of getting old is that you become more and more rigid in your belief structure, when actually, if you can keep your mind open and not ask people, how could they be so ridiculous, but also say, tell me about that. And again, as I said, I'm sure that's not a revelation for a lot of people, but it has been a bit of a awakening, a revelation for me.
And the idea that through that you could actually learn something through that process.
Absolutely.
You might not be converted into thinking that Uri Geller does indeed know how to bend spoons, but that perspective could teach you something about human.
Because frankly,
I don't know.
Because frankly, who cares if he can bend spoons? I mean, as we said, if one had superpowers, why would you only devote them to bending cutlery? I mean, why not bend bigger things? I don't know. But again, the notion that people are able to influence others, again, is a fascinating thing. And again, I think. Again, when I take that to the medical profession, we were constantly reassuring people or trying to inform them. And of course, now through COVID, we've seen that if you don't communicate well, people won't follow your advice. And the next thing you know is people don't know who to believe. There you go. I think clarity and transparency, whilst difficult, are also what people expect. And I think nowadays the given narrative is, well, of course, you can't trust the medical profession. My view is, well, then who are you going to trust? Because then the world is much more frightening if you can't believe anybody. So again, there we go. There's me kind of saying, look, intensive care is scary, and I didn't realise how scary it was. And other people might go, well, I bloody told you that. And I said, well, I know, and I now I'm going to listen. I'm going to try and listen. I'm going to try and listen.
But I love that.
I can't look. I have a whole lifetime to change.
No, exactly. It doesn't happen overnight. Now, the reason I've opened my phone while we were talking
is so rude, Will. You just sat there with your phone.
Well, I'm going to explain why. Something that you said about memory struck me, and there's a new collection of essays that's come out called The Vast Extent by Lavinia Greenlaw. She's a poet. This is a book of essays. I think you would get a lot out of this. I think our listeners would, because she talks about, I think her brother was a psychologist. He unfortunately passed away when this book was published. Worked a lot with him, had a lot of conversations about memory. And a lot of this book is about memory and the idea that we actually cannot ever see anything at all purely, but only through our own memories.
Absolutely.
Always. And so we have to contend with that. There's no such thing as just seeing things for what they are.
No, and so
I guess that should be obvious. That's probably not news to a lot of people.
I don't think it is obvious, because we're all desperately trying to pretend that we're in control, and that how we remember it is how we remember it. And as I said, even for me, I tell stories. I tell a story. That I used to wander around the ward and look at people's wounds and look at their drips. And my wife said to me, "What are you doing?" And she says, "You said to me, I'm just checking their wounds." Yeah. She said, "No, I know that, but why?" And she said, "You looked at me and said, I don't know." And that is a true story, but I don't remember it. And yet, for me, it happened. A bit like my mum and dad used to have that video high 8 camera stuff, and there's one of me, a little toddler, sat on the grass, and my sister runs up behind me and pours a bucket of water on my head. Now, I don't remember that, but I do have a certain sense of the relationship between me and my older sister, somehow through that, and I can't, as you said about a memory, how it's encoded for me. My mum will say, "Don't be so ridiculous," but that's not my experience of it, and so that to me, again, that to me is when I try now to be open more about other people's writing. I try to hear what they're trying to say, like with Life Story. I try, rather than me say, "Oh, don't be ridiculous," and that's not frightening. Well, it's irrelevant what I think. I actually need to listen to them, because ironically, for me, through my recovery, things like anxiety. So, for example, I never understood what anxiety was. I never had it. But first time I tried to fly after the crash, I found myself stowed outside the hall, feeling very peculiar and not knowing what I don't know what's going on. And actually, one of the Qantas staff came up to me and said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I don't think I am okay."
Yeah, wow.
And she said, "What's?" And I sort of. So I think I'm afraid. And she said, "Oh, have you not flown before?" I said, "No, I've flown hundreds of times." And that was a peculiar thing, was suddenly to recognise. And of course, then you go, "God, it must be bloody awful being afraid." And I know, again, everybody who has lived with that and dealt with it will hear me say that and go, "Oh, right, welcome to the world." Well, yeah. Do you know what? A bit like if you're really tall, welcome to the world of being short. It's not that it's not.
It's just completely out of your experience.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden it is, and you're just grappling with this. Well, what is this?
And also you realise how incredibly difficult it is, and
precisely,
and how upsetting it is. And again, I deeply regret not being in touch with that at an earlier age. And I'm sure, and I know that medical schools now spend much more time trying to connect.
Well, does it go back to what you were saying before about that lack of empathy?
Yeah, and mine's a natural one. And, look, if you work in intensive care when there are 25, 30 people who are all tragic, 20% of those people will die.
Yes.
People say, well, how do you deal with that? Well, I mean, I dealt with it very naturally.
Just maintain that distance.
Silo.
Purely mechanical, silo, just get the job done.
And the stories that are in the memoir are actually much more about the time when that barrier dropped. My son nearly drowned. My wife nearly bled to death, sort of thing. And again, I don't write about them explicitly, but I know that inside those stories are not ones I've managed to silo. They're not.
Well, because you had that pre-existing emotional connection, presumably.
There you go. And actually, and I've realised that I was deliberately avoiding making a connection, because my experience of dealing with emergencies is if you're emotionally clouded by the event, you can't think straight.
You literally can't do the job.
You can't think straight.
Yeah.
So again, I wouldn't. A bit like being a CEO of a company. Again, let's make it more a generic thing. Is that CEOs have to make terrible decisions, and that's just the job. And if you find that upsetting,
you're in the wrong profession.
You are. I think therefore, I guess with writers, that horrible sort of vast number of rejections in itself. Again, obviously, I'm starting to understand that. That kind of judgment of what you've written, and yet you've committed yourself. You've given it everything that you have, and then someone else says, "Well, I'm not sure." And again, I guess that's part of the experience. Part of the experience. And I've often said to people, I think you probably heard me ask you, is if I'm a painter, I don't send my painting to someone else who then daubs on it. Whereas as a writer, I send it to you and you write all over it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, again, that's a fascinating thing. And again,
in that respect, it's more collaborative, isn't it? I mean, you are the primary creator, but you've got this input from all these other people.
But there you go, Will. And I didn't know that.
Okay,
I didn't know that writing was such a team thing. And I know it's not. I know there's a drive. And I don't know. You tell me. I suspect that the more successful one becomes, the less one's team may or may not contribute. But I gather that actually, as you said, writing is often a team thing. And again, that means communicating your thoughts. It means somebody else saying, what? Because the first time I sent a manuscript to someone, he literally wrote back and said, you portray yourself as some sort of savant genius. And you're always joking about terrible things.
Right.
He said,
"This is not going to warm. Readers aren't going to warm to this.
They're not going to warm to it." And again, I realised that very much early on that was the medic's voice, as if I was sat, you and I, telling you a story in a pub about some hilarious thing that had happened to a woman. When of course I'm partly telling you to exercise that demon.
Well, it's that kind of gallows humour, isn't it?
There you go. Exactly that. And I think that feigned, as my psychiatrist, when he read what I'd written, he said it's typical feigned indifference and dark humour. He says that's the style of communication. Now I have to, I think, get away from that a bit, because unless you're a medic,
they won't understand.
They won't understand. He's not joking about the fact that the kid's dead.
Yeah.
He's saying, I don't have words to express how I feel, so I'm going to make a joke.
That's really going on. Yes, exactly.
And so again, I think, so when I read other people's work now, I often find myself kind of seeing the pain, because I think now people are much more explicit about, let's say, for example, gender issues or sexuality issues, or whereas those are not things that we would have talked about, because we never had the insight. And that's one of my interesting things about me talking about me being Benjamin Button, is actually insight is very painful. Coming to realise, like I imagine with junior doctors, it's much more of a struggle, because the more you're in touch with who and what you are, the harder it is to dispel it, the harder it is to pretend it's not happening. And again, I was lucky to be sort of white and middle class in a collective identity of medicine that was very much I fitted in. Now, if you're not, white, and if you're not of a certain, let's say, for example, class and male and all those things that fit into medicine, it's actually hard to fit in. And now it's quite hard to even understand the group you're in. And again, I'm trying I'm having to, with myself, is re-engineer that and go, okay, so come on, did you really think it was funny? Well, no. And did you drink too much because and did you, like, for example, now I don't particularly like social occasions. And again, the conversations with my counsellor has been, well, I don't think you're different. He said, I think you're just now exposed to things that you weren't before, because you used to hide behind your medicine, hide behind your work, hide behind your medicine, hide behind your position. And now actually you just walk into a room and people go, oh, hello. And that, as I said, I think that's a really valuable and very uncomfortable thing. And as I said, it's as we said at the very beginning, that's because I'm very lucky to have had that previous life and to have another go at this one. So it's fantastic. I love it.
Second chance. It's amazing. I think in that respect, it's there's a horrible cliched saying, but I'll say it anyway, which is change is a gift, and sometimes it actually is.
It's uncomfortable, and again, I think you're right. No, it is, and I think it's a bit like when people talk about grief and they talk about acceptance as the final stage of that. It's acceptance doesn't mean that you're okay with it. No, it doesn't mean that you're hey, this is great. You're saying, well, it happened.
Yes.
And also, you also don't get to decide when that's the case. It just comes upon you to realise that you're okay with it. And as I said, I mean, I've listened to Edith Eger talk about her experiences at Auschwitz. That's a young girl whose both her parents were executed on the first day she arrived, and yet she survived. And she didn't make an effort. She wasn't, calling upon. She was just saying, I'm going to survive today, and I'm going to see what tomorrow's like. And it's only much later in her life is she able to put words to that and share those experiences with us. And she says, I mean, that's why the book's called The Choice. She says, you have a choice. She said, if you, like, for example, for me, if you are terribly traumatised and sad, and she said that, I understand that. But you do have a choice. You do have a choice to get up and go, well, come on, let's see what tomorrow brings. And I figure that there's the truth, that whatever befalls us, No one's saying it was easy. No one's saying that that it's not a struggle. And if you need additional help, then fine. Or if you can find those answers on your own, that's fine. A bit like, let's say, writing a book is however many people are going to edit for you, you still have to write it.
Exactly.
And that may be, you have to do the work.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that it's easy,
no.
nor to say that it'll necessarily succeed even. But that's how it is. And again, I think if you're a tiny little sort of wizened lady like Edith is, maybe it's easy to not sound like you're saying toughen up. And I'm not saying toughen up because I'm very open to say that I do spend periods of time very dark and tearful. What I've learnt is that they pass, though, and you just have to kind of, as I wrote once, you just have to hang on.
Yeah.
And that's how it is. And so, as I said, writing is all of this kind of insight has come through the crash. And that's why it's been a gift.
Yeah, extraordinary.
If you like.
Well, Bruce Powell, thanks for joining us on Podstreet. I think despite being a fledgling author, I think you've still got a lot to teach or to impart to more experienced writers. So thank you.
Oh,
it's been a great
you.
pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.